North Africa, 1941. An infinite ocean of sand where empires came to die. There were no cities to hide in, no rivers to defend just a 600-mile wasteland where the sun was as lethal as an artillery shell. This was a war of pure movement, a war of vengeance. Into this furnace, Hitler sent a commander who had no interest in the rule book. His name was Erwin Rommel. When Rommel landed, the Axis front was in a state of total collapse. The British expected him to play it safe to dig in and wait for supplies. They were wrong. Rommel didn't wait for Berlin's permission. He didn't wait for his full panzer divisions. He saw a gap in the British lines and he struck immediately. He led from the very front, covered in the same dust as his men, earning a name that would haunt the British for years, the Desert Fox. But the desert is a mechanical graveyard. The Panzer III and IV were masterclasses in engineering, but they weren't built for the Sahara. Fine sand turned oil into sandpaper, destroying air filters in hours. Inside the steel hulls, temperatures hit 50 degrees Celsius. In this war, a broken fan belt was a death sentence. To win, Rommel had to push his machines past the point of mechanical failure. Rommel's greatest trick wasn't a tank, it was a gun designed to shoot down planes. He realized the 88mm flak gun had enough velocity to punch through any British armor at 2 kilometers. He would lure British tanks into a chase, lead them over a ridge, and reveal a hidden line of 88s waiting in the sand. It wasn't a battle. It was an execution. The British Crusader tanks were the fastest things on the dunes, but they were fragile. Their crews were incredibly brave, charging into the dust storms with nothing but grit and thin armor. They were winning the battles of courage, but losing the war of attrition. The British Empire was bleeding out in the sand. They needed more than just bravery. They needed a leader who could outthink the fox. By April 1941, Rommel had chased the British across hundreds of miles, but he hit a wall at the port city of Tobruk. For 240 days, a force of mostly Australian desert rats held the line under a constant rain of Stuka dive bombers and Panzer shells. It was Rommel's first taste of frustration. No matter how many times he struck, the fortress refused to crack. Tobruk became a thorn in his side that bled his supply lines dry. The desert is a war of logistics. Every bullet, every loaf of bread, and every liter of fuel had to be shipped across a Mediterranean sea controlled by the British Royal Navy. Rommel's panzers were the most feared machines on Earth. But they were useless without gasoline. For every mile he advanced, his supply line became more vulnerable. Hitler's eyes were fixed on Russia, leaving the Desert Fox to beg for the scraps of the German war machine. In November 1941, the British launched Operation Crusader. It was one of the largest and most chaotic tank battles in history. For weeks, thousands of men fought in a blinding haze of dust and smoke where it was impossible to tell friend from foe. It was a brutal war of attrition. Rommel was finally forced to retreat, but he did so with the grace of a predator, waiting for the British to make one fatal mistake. The British leadership was in shambles until August 1942, when a new man arrived in Cairo, Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery. He was the polar opposite of Rommel. He didn't believe in instinct or luck. He was a cold, calculating perfectionist who lived in a simple trailer and demanded absolute discipline. He told his men, "The orders are we stay here alive, or we stay here dead." The era of the British retreat was over. Geography finally dictated the end of the game. Actualmente, the desert foiled gaps in the impassable Katara depression. Rommel could no longer outflank his enemies. He had to go through them. This was the spot where the Fox's speed meant nothing. Montgomery was building a wall of steel, and Rommel was about to find out what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object. Montgomery didn't just bring new tanks. He brought a new mindset. He banned the word retreat from the British vocabulary. He spent weeks rebuilding the morale of the 8th Army, turning a defeated force into a precision instrument. While Rommel relied on the fingertip feeling of the battlefield, Monty relied on the cold, hard math of logistics and overwhelming firepower. He was preparing a hammer, and he wouldn't strike until he was certain it would shatter the fox. Rommel knew he couldn't win a war of attrition, so he turned the desert into a trap. He planted over half a million landmines, a lethal belt of explosives known as the Devil's Gardens. His goal was to funnel the British tanks into killing zones where his 88s were waiting. It was a masterpiece of defensive engineering, designed to break the tracks and the spirit of any British soldier who dared to cross. But Montgomery had a trick of his own. In one of the greatest deceptions of World War II, he launched Operation Bertram. Using plywood, paint, and canvas, he created an entire ghost army. He made Rommel believe the main attack was coming from the south, while in reality, he was massing his true strength in the north. The Desert Fox, the master of the ruse, was finally being outfoxed. On the night of October 23, 1942, the desert sky turned white. Montgomery unleashed a 1,000-gun barrage, the largest seen since the First World War, for 5 hours. The ground literally shook as nearly 1 million shells rained down on the German lines. It wasn't just an attack, it was a statement. The time for maneuvering was over. The British hammer had finally fallen. The battle was a meat grinder. For 10 days, men fought hand-to-hand in the dust of the Devil's Gardens, but the math was on Montgomery's side. He had more men, more fuel, and the new American Sherman tanks. One by one, the German panzers were picked off. Rommel, short on fuel and facing total annihilation, realized the game was up. For the first time in his life, the Fox had no choice but to run. The retreat from El Alamein was a 1,500-mile nightmare. Rommel's Afrika Korps was a shadow of its former self, fleeing across the same dunes they had conquered just months before. Hitler, safely in a bunker thousands of miles away, ordered Rommel to stand and die, but the Fox was a realist. He ignored the Führer, choosing to save his men rather than sacrifice them for a lost cause. He was a commander without a country, and he was running out of road. In February 1943, Rommel turned around and bit back. At the Kasserine Pass, he launched a lightning strike against the inexperienced Americans. In a matter of days, he inflicted a humiliating defeat, destroying hundreds of US vehicles and killing thousands. It was a reminder to the world that even a wounded fox was lethal. It was the first time the US Army felt the true weight of the German war machine, and it changed their doctrine forever. The victory at Kasserine was a brilliant tactical success, but it couldn't change the strategic reality. The Axis was trapped in the Tunisian pocket. On one side, Montgomery's veteran 8th Army. On the other, the rising tide of American industrial might. Rommel's supply lines were gone. His tanks were out of fuel. The desert had become a cage, and the bars were closing in. By the spring of 1943, the war had changed. The open plains of the desert were replaced by the jagged peaks of the Tunisian mountains. Rommel was gone, but the men he left behind were trapped in a tightening circle. The British surged from the east, the Americans from the west, and the Allied air forces dominated the skies. Rommel was a broken man. The Axis was no longer fighting for desert sores. They were fighting for time, and realizing that Hitler would never send the reinforcements he needed, he was ordered back to Germany. He left Africa for the last time, leaving behind a legendary reputation and a doomed army. The Fox was gone, but the war he started in the sand was about to reach its final, bloody conclusion. On May 13, 1943, the desert went silent. Over 275,000 Axis troops surrendered, a force larger than the one lost at Stalingrad. The legendary Afrika Korps ceased to exist. Hitler's dream of a Mediterranean empire was buried in the Tunisian sand. For the Allies, it was the end of the beginning. The road to Sicily, Italy, and eventually Berlin was finally open. Behind the scenes, the German high command was fracturing. A group of officers, realizing Hitler was leading Germany to total destruction, launched a plot to assassinate the Führer. Rommel's name was found in the conspirators' files. Whether he truly knew about the bomb or simply wanted a separate piece, the Gestapo didn't care. To Hitler, his favorite general had become a traitor. On October 14, 1944, two generals arrived at Rommel's home. They gave him a choice: a public trial and the execution of his family, or a cyanide pill and a state funeral with honors. The Desert Fox chose his family. He walked to a waiting car, took the poison, and died in minutes. The Nazi regime told the world he died of war wounds. The man who had survived the desert furnace was finally taken down by his own side. Erwin Rommel and Bernard Montgomery never met face to face, yet they knew each other better than most friends. They were the twin poles of the Desert War, one a flash of lightning, the other a crushing hammer. Rommel became a legend even to his enemies. A man whose skill was so great that British commanders had to tell their troops he wasn't a magician. Montgomery, the clinical perfectionist, proved that in modern war, grit is nothing without a plan. Together, they turned a wasteland into a masterclass of military history. Today, the tanks are gone, rusted away or sitting in museums. The minefields are still there. Hidden beneath the dunes of Egypt and Tunisia, lethal reminder of a war that ended 80 years ago. The North African campaign was the end of the beginning. It was where the Allies learned how to win, and where the Desert Fox finally ran out of road. In the silence of the Sahara, the ghosts of the Panzers and the desert rats still remain. This is the legacy of the desert. This is Dust of Media.